Hello again. We're looking at Israel moment number 42. More scripture calling Israel a spiritual Sodom.
Hello, this is Pastor Stephen Anderson from Faithful Word Baptist Church in Tempe, Arizona. Today I want to talk about Jeremiah 23:14, where the Bible reads, "I have seen also in the prophets of Jerusalem a horrible thing. They commit adultery and walk in lies. They strengthen also the hands of evildoers, that none doth return from his wickedness. They are all of them unto me as Sodom, and the inhabitants thereof as Gomorrah." Now, of course, this was spoken a long time ago about those dwelling in Jerusalem.
Yes, this was spoken of in the Old Testament when they were still God's chosen people. And I believe, and have shown in this video, that they are still God's chosen people. I'm just using, Steve's kind of terminology, where he believes in the Old Testament they were God's chosen people, and in the New Testament they're not. Well, so in the Old Testament, it's calling them, spiritually Sodom when they're God's chosen people. So what would this teaching have to do with anything towards proving they're not? Because he said that they behaved that way in the Old Testament and they were still his chosen people. So it really has nothing to do with anything. I don't know if I've watched this. We'll just play a couple minutes, see if he says anything
But
else.
it could still be said today that those in Jerusalem strengthen the hands of the evildoers and that they are spiritually Sodom. I proved it in the last couple of videos, the last few moments that showed all those scriptures where the Bible is likening the nation of Israel unto Sodom, even in the last days. We've seen the evidence that Tel Aviv is considered the #1 tourist place for homos to take their vacations. We've seen the queer pride parades that happen every year in Israel. The only place in the Middle East where they happen just happens to be spiritual Sodom, also known as Israel. It says here that they strengthen the hands of the evildoers. They promote it. They tolerate it. They act like it's normal to be sodomite, just like in America, where we're taught that it's an alternative lifestyle and that homosexuality is wonderful and people are born that way and we shouldn't say anything against it. It's the same way in Israel as it is in the United States.
Oh, so Steve would say that people are not born that way, which I agree with him. People are not born that way. I'll just go over this one more time, just because I like to. Romans chapter 1. Says that, verse 26, "For this cause God gave them up unto vile affections. For even their women did change the natural use into that which is against nature," meaning they're not made that way. "Likewise also the men, leaving the natural use of the woman, burn in their lust one toward another, men with men, working that which is unseemly, and receiving in themselves that recompense of their error which was meet." So, being sodomite is against nature. You're not born that way, even though a lot of people will parrot that and say, "Oh yes, people are born that way." Even scientific studies have proven there's no such thing as like a gay gene or anything. You're not born that way. Now, Galatians chapter 2, Paul says in verse 15, "We who are Jews by nature." So if you're not born gay, because you can't be born that it's against nature, looks like you can be born Jewish. So that is genetic, where being born sodomite is not genetic. However, in all my discussions with Steve, and anytime I put forth this question to him, how can you be a Jew by nature if it's not, if being Jewish is not ethnic? He doesn't say anything. The one thing I addressed in a previous video is he said about being a natural born citizen of Israel. That's how you're a Jew by nature. Well, Paul wasn't born in Israel. He was born in Tarsus, so it has nothing to do with that. There are just certain things that I will constantly ask him, when he makes a smart comment or asks me a question, and he just won't reply to him because the scriptures have him cornered. He can't explain it, and he refuses to admit that he's wrong, so he doesn't say anything. So anyway, has no bearing on people, the Jews being spiritually Sodom. or Israel being spiritually Sodom has no bearing on the promises that God made to them. And what's funny is I think in each of the last 3 videos is he used an Old Testament passage to show that they were called spiritually Sodom, and they were identified with sodomy and sodomites and things like that. Well, in the Old Testament, Steve would even agree that they're God's people. So the way that they're behaving really has nothing to do with whether they're God's people or not, which is I don't know. It's what he tried to use Zechariah to show that they were God's chosen people in the Old Testament, and then that passage from Zechariah 2:7 about it being the apple of his eye. He said, well, that's the Old Testament, they're the apple of his eye. Well, Steve, that's the Old Testament where they're behaving spiritually like Sodom and Gomorrah. So you trying to teach that because they behave that way makes them not God's chosen people really doesn't mean anything, because they behaved that way when they were God's chosen people. Or I should say, I'm just using his terms. They are God's chosen people, but he would say even when they were in the Old Testament, they still behave that way. So it doesn't have any bearing on whether they are or aren't God's chosen people. 3 more foolish videos he put up. So I think that's it for this video, guys. It's probably a couple minutes too long, but anyway, thanks for being patient with me as I go through these. And sometimes, I admit, I get a little long-winded and get off topic, and I appreciate your grace when that happens. So take care. Have a good night.